Welcome to the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Hi, and welcome back to the HERHealth Podcast, where we explore ideas that are reshaping health, education, and social systems to better serve women, girls, and gender-diverse people, especially those affected by violence, adversity, and systemic inequities. In today's episode, we're honored to highlight a powerful and thought-provoking AVA webinar titled Reclaiming a Sovereign Imagination, Meaningful Assessment in Higher Education from a Blackfoot Perspective, presented by Dr. Gabrielle Weasel Head of Mount Royal University. This conversation is situated within the terrain of the transformative. Dr. Weasel Head invites us to critically examine how cultural paradigms shape not only our knowledge systems, but also how we relate to each other and to the world around us. She challenges conventional models of assessment in higher education and offers a vision rooted in Blackfoot ways of knowing, one that reclaims space for relational, ethical, and diverse approaches to learning and evaluation. So get ready for a conversation that calls us to reimagine education through the lens of relationality and transformative possibility. Let's begin.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity, or AVA's webinar series. Since we have webinars every Wednesday, we call this series Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. With AVA, I'm an early career researcher and lead and host of the webinar series alongside my colleagues Jason, Andrea, and Isra. I want to begin by acknowledging that, on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, and visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I'd like to share just a couple of procedural things. First and foremost, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to AVA's YouTube channel shortly, so you can revisit this and all of our other resources whenever you would like. You're also welcome to share them with family, friends, and colleagues. After this introduction, I will post the link in the chat where you can access those. The chat function has been disabled except for the hosts and co-hosts who can communicate with you. So throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function to pose questions to our speaker, or if you're having technical issues, you can post them in the Q&A as well, and I'll get back to you as quickly as possible. We'll also make time at the end of the webinar to have a conversation with our speaker based on any questions that you post in the Q&A. The focus of today's webinar is Reclaiming a Sovereign Imagination, Meaningful Assessment in Higher Education from a Blackfoot Perspective. We are joined by Dr. Gabrielle Weasel Head of Mount Royal University. She belongs to the lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy and is a member of the Kainaiwa Nation. An associate professor of Indigenous Studies, Dr. Weasel Head's research focuses on developing ethical spaces of engagement in scholarship of teaching and learning, curriculum development, and actively embodies Indigenous research methods in a diverse context ranging from resilient studies to professional development revamps. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah, and I'm very happy to be here. So my is entitled Reclaiming a Sovereign Imagination, Meaningful Assessment in Higher Education from a Blackfoot Perspective. And so I'm just going to jump right into it. So for today, what I would like to share is just really, I'd like to have just a discussion, even just sharing in a more informal way about the things that I'm really passionate about, and that's understanding worldviews, understanding how worldviews are connected to our knowledge and the practices that we accept as normal. And then what does it mean to reclaim a sovereign imagination? I didn't come up with this term sovereign imagination. So where did I come up with it? I want to talk a little bit about that. And then this notion of going inward. And I'd like to conclude with offering some examples of frameworks for self-evaluation that I use in my own practice. And so with that being said, I'm just going to get started with a formal introduction of myself. So, okay, everyone, Nistuni Daniko Tsapinaaki, Namochdo Gena. I just introduced myself in my Blackfoot language. My name is Gabrielle Weasel Head. I am from Gena First Nation, also known as the Blood Tribe. In front of me, I have images, or in front of you, there'll be images of Nanastico Chief Mountain, the Old Man River, and an image of my community. And so I always honor the lands, the waters, and the people that have shaped who I am, have shaped my knowledge. And so I consider the Rocky Mountains, the backbone of the world, to be just as much a part of my genealogy as my physical human ancestors. I consider the sacred waters that flow through the lands of the Blackfoot peoples just as much a part of me as the blood that flows through my veins. I honor the Blackfoot Confederacy for providing me with with a sense of belonging and just that worldview, that connectedness, that collective consciousness that has really inspired me to be nidapi, to be a real person. So the Kainai Nation is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So the Blackfoot Confederacy consists of Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfoot speaking peoples. These include Bigani, Siksiga, Skapi Bigani, and then Gaina. So there's different pronunciations. There's Kainai, there's also Gaina, but I use Gaina. That is the traditional way we pronounce our nation. And I would like to introduce you to my ancestors and to my parents. So my ancestors here include my great-grandparents and my grandparents. And my parents are pictured in the center top of your screen. And so my parents are Eagle Ribs, an American horsewoman, or Peter and Wanda Weasel Head. The image to the right there are my maternal great-grandparents, Mike and Kathleen Eagle Speaker. At the bottom right are my paternal grandparents, Mukakin and Buna Weasel Head. And then the bottom, just below my parents, are my maternal grandparents, Alan and Beulah, standing alone. And then I have my other set of maternal grandparents, Henry and Louise, standing alone. And then at the top left is my old grandfather, Tsatsuki Boyi, or Center Talker. He's also known as Old Man Iron, and that's my dad's grandfather, so my great grandfather. I honor my ancestors today. I ask that they join me as I share this knowledge that shapes who I am as a Blackfoot person. And it's very important for me to center the lands and the waters and my ancestors, because for years as a Blackfoot person, I've had my identity defined for me. My history has been relegated to myth. My epistemology and ontologies have been seen as primitive. My spirituality has been looked upon as superstition. My technologies have been categorized as Stone Age, and the stories of my people are now considered legends. So it's really incredibly important for me to assert my identity, my relationship to the land, because we've had these things defined for us. And so I move on to this slide, and you'll see two quotations here. These slides or this slide in particular speaks about knowledge. And as Indigenous people, especially for Indigenous scholars, we're very concerned with advancing an understanding of not only what we know, but how we come to this knowledge. Um, and we're concerned with advancing this because it's at the system of thought that Indigenous people have been most misunderstood, And since settlers have been coming onto these lands, we've been trying to convince the political and social systems of thought that culture matters. How we experience our culture matters, how others perceive our culture matters, and whether others care about our culture, that matters too. We're also preoccupied with dialoguing about what it means to be a human being because, as Indigenous scholars such as Linda Tuhiwai Smith have suggested, we have deep knowledge of what it means to have our humanness defined for us. So we care about advancing an understanding of our humanity because too often we have been stripped of it. So I want to talk a little bit about my work. And my work, first and foremost, is really about clarity and finding clarity in a world where, for me, as a Blackfoot person growing up in Canada and growing up on the largest Indian reserve in Canada, there was a lot of things that didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me that I grew up on an Indian reserve. I used to wonder, why am I on a reserve? Like, don't they place, wild African animals on reserves? And I was thinking about that when I was a kid. Why do we have these African reserves and on all of these nature documentaries that I watch, and then yet here I am, I'm living on a reserve too. So what message did that send me as a child growing up? And also thinking about my schooling experience. And even though I grew up on the largest Indian reserve in Canada and I went to school there, we were still learning provincial curriculum, the same provincial curriculum that every other child in Alberta was learning. And so the social studies textbooks, they had this narrative of Native people as, we were just these wandering, Stone Age primitive people that were just waiting for settlers to come and save us. And as soon as they got here, we just kind of lied there and gave away all our land and say, here you are the more advanced culture. Here's all our land. And I mean, it didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I felt like I was basically part of the local wildlife. And so my work is really about clarity. It is. It's about, I need to be clear on why we accept the things that we accept in today's society. Why is everybody okay that Indigenous people, First Nations people are relegated to Indian reserves? Why is it okay that stereotypes abound and we accept these stereotypes? So it really is about that. And then looking for parallels. And this is something that was introduced to me by Elder Dr. Reggie Croshu from the Begunny Nation. And he talks a lot about parallels and how for every settler system, every Western system, whether that's an economic system or a social system, education system, for Blackfoot people and other Indigenous people, we have a parallel system. We have an education, we have our own education system, our own economic system, all of that. We have our social norms, all of that. And so it's really about, for me, finding parallels and also too challenging what we consider to be innovation. And I talk with my students about this, and I'm very much consumed with this idea of innovation, if you will. And so what does it mean to be innovative, right? And if we look at the definition of innovation, it's like, you know, you're taking new ideas and you're applying these new ideas to old world problems, or you're, you know, you're progressing, you know, it's all about newness and progress and forward thinking and looking ahead. But I think for Indigenous people, you know, we've never been considered innovative in, and I often wonder why, you know, for even though we were able to sustain our way of life for thousands and thousands of years, and maintain a balance, and as much as we were able to, this equilibrium amongst all of our relatives, human and non-human alike, we needed to be innovative. We needed to be responsive to the changing contexts of our environment, the changing nature of our relationships. And we needed to ensure that we were maintaining balance, and that we would continue as Blackfoot people. And so innovation is not just simply about new and better. It's really about being responsive to the changing nature of our environment. It's being responsive to the constant flux. So for Indigenous people, that innovation lies in the creative expressions of cultural continuity that are embodied through song, through storytelling, through dance. And this transcends Western notions of newness. So, really following the pathways of ancestral knowledge resists notions of Eurocentric progress, which is really based in economic expansion and resource extraction. And so, really, my work is really around what does it mean to be innovative, and exploring that and looking at the process of things rather than the outcomes. And so, you know, the process itself are going to, I would say, really define our outcomes at the end of the day. So it's not just process for the sake of process, but it's really process that drives us toward a set of desired outcomes. And then responsibility is connected to my ethics as a Blackfoot person. So our lifeways revolve around our responsibilities as Blackfoot people. So we're responsible to construct our lifeways, to honor and be accountable to our relational alliances. So we exist because of our relationships. And so what I do in my work is really guided by these, you know, by these concepts. And I would say this work has led me to explore many different, you know, many different research areas, whether that's in, you know, child intervention, parenting capacity assessment reform and child intervention. Um, how do we infuse Indigenous ways of knowing into business methodologies such as needs assessment, SWOT analysis, things like that? So I'm really excited about sharing some of my work with you today. And so, what are the intentions of my talk this afternoon? And I think it's really about nourishing and deepening relationships. And so, deepening our relationship to knowledge, having us take a step back and ask ourselves, you know, what is my relationship to my own knowledge? How does my culture and my experiences shape how I come to knowledge? Is knowledge something that I can buy? Is knowledge something that can be patented? Is knowledge something that we hold collectively, or does it start as an individual germination? So, this little framework here that I have of connecting, creating, moving, and reflecting, I this came out of Blackfoot resilience research project that I had um, that I was involved in, that I was leading a few years ago. And so I think in terms of connecting and connection really speaks to the holistic importance of our relationships. So to be connected to the land, to be connected to our relations and to self is to really push back against the violence of disconnection and calls into the present, into our consciousness, the healing power of relationships to elevate what's already here and what's to come. And creativity, so creating is about connecting to our gifts. And we all have gifts, like every single one of us has a gift. And I think it's our responsibility to figure out what that gift is. And once we figure out what that gift is, are we going to accept it? Are we going to use that gift and reciprocate back to our relations? And then movement. And this part here is I think we can only go as far as we're open to moving, right? So our movement through space and time and being conscious of how we're moving. Like, and when I say moving, it's like whether we're moving towards different set of values, or we're moving towards, a transformed perspective. But we got to be conscious of that to resist this, operating in autopilot where we're not, where a really good example of this is Dr. Michael Yellowbird's work around neurodecolonization. And he challenges us to be mindful in our day-to-day lives, because we're operating in like this mindless, in many ways in today's modern society, in this mindless sort of running around and getting all of this stuff done and not taking time to be present and say, what is happening uh with me right now, what emotions am I feeling, and how do I sit with myself in transformative ways to reflect. And reflection is really the pathway towards this embodied self knowledge and gaining an understanding that we are our biggest teacher's self. Reflection is about making positive meaning from our life experiences so we can identify reference points for transformative growth. And then I want to talk about how the importance of understanding the context of our education, understanding the context of our learning and our assessment practices. And this is a really high level sort of overview of that context. And I don't think in many regards, we get an opportunity in our education experiences, aside from philosophy classes or something like that, to really take a step back and really explore how paradigms, how worldviews, how these shape our assessment practices in ways that will allow us to be critically mindful of the cultural frame of reference that we're bringing to our assessment practices, or whatever it is that we do. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So I have a couple of slides here, but I have this one slide, but I don't think I'm going to talk about this one too much. This is really about the research practices. Uh, and I think I want to skip over this a little bit, and I don't have that much time, so I want to be strategic in what I'm sharing with you. And I want to come to this slide because this slide is about emotions. And how do we set up learning experiences that put us in the kind of energy where where not only our students feel confident, but we as educators feel confident as well. Because assessment and the types of assessment that we use um, can have a huge impact on students' emotions. Assessment can incite fear. Assessment can even bring us to guilty feelings for not being prepared enough. Oh, I feel guilty because I'm not a good student. I feel angry because I can't get, I can't understand this. And then if we bring in the whole academic integrity piece, when a student is confronted with a high stakes assessment and they don't know what to do, and then they might turn to AI, or they might turn to practices that are going to really compromise their academic integrity. So when that happens, then there's shame. Shame starts, that students will start feeling this shame. So I think we really need to understand that emotions play a part in our learning. And if we're in a fear response or a stress response, it's going to be very difficult for us to access the smartest part of our brains, and that neocortex, to be able to retrieve information, to be able to think critically, to be able to think abstractly when we're just sitting there and we're just stressed out over this test that's in front of us, and we're upset, we're driven by fear. So I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind when you're designing assessments, or even when as a student, when you are confronted with an assignment or a test. What do you do to sort of get you into that calm space? And so one way is to set up assessments where students have, where there's, before tests are given, there is a 5-minute pause where you're doing a breathing activity with students for 5 minutes, even, where they can sort of connect with their breath. They can focus on their breath. So they're focusing on something rather than just launching right into the test or something. And so I think it's really important to talk about emotions when we are talking about student assessment. And then as I jump into our next set of slides, I want to be very clear and transparent about why I am talking about worldviews, and why it's really important that I elevate Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous worldviews. And so I want to talk very briefly, and this isn't to offer any kind of negative critique or anything, but this is for us to consider some things here. So when we're braiding or weaving, the approaches oftentimes in research or program planning is, let's braid Indigenous knowledges into Western knowledge systems. Let's weave Indigenous knowledges into Western knowledge systems. And I want to talk a little bit about why we should resist that, because when we're elevating Indigenous knowledges, we're bringing them out of sort of, we're seeing their distinctness, and we're engaging with that distinctness and building a relationship with that. We're not simply weaving things into an existing knowledge system that is incredibly dominant. So let's think for a minute about what it means to braid or to weave. So in order to braid or weave and have a cohesive tapestry, we need to have we need to have sorry about that. We need to have like threads, or these materials, these threads, they need to be of equal width and of equal length in order to create this uniform tapestry or a uniform braid. But if we think about the dominance of the Western knowledge system, it's like this thick braid of rope here that's pictured at the top right. And for Indigenous knowledges, they're incredibly resilient, incredibly um, strong, but they're, in terms of their dominance, they're almost invisible, and so this is a spider web here. This is an image of a spider, or of a thin spider web strand. And so how do you braid these things together without the spider web completely becoming absorbed into this thick rope? It's not going to happen. So my point is, inevitably Indigenous knowledges will be absorbed into the dominating Western knowledge system. So this is how I think about things when I'm doing my research, when I'm doing my teaching, when I'm doing my work. And this has been informed by the elders that I work with, that I've been privileged to learn from, that we really need to step away from this braiding and weaving, and we need to start look at elevating our knowledges and honoring the distinct nature. So we need to start resisting integration and so there's risks associated with trying to integrate Indigenous and Western ways of knowing because of philosophical differences and the power inequalities that favor settler traditions. So I'll just go over some of those risks here. So we weaken Indigenous traditions by generalizing and taking them out of context. And so that's why, in many ways, we have people talking about, say, the 7 grandfather teachings of Anishinaabe knowledge system, and they're talking about implementing that in Blackfoot territory, or people thinking that there is one medicine wheel template that could be applied to all Indigenous realities, something like that. So it's really, we're weakening those traditions by taking this pan-Indigenous approach. And oftentimes that's what ends up happening, is this pan-Indigenous approach, and then denying differences in order to find commonality. Again, that pan-indigeneity, where, even though Indigenous nations, we have fundamental values that we can agree on, but we also are very distinct in our practices as well. So, and then assimilating Indigenous knowledge in such a way that it becomes invisible. I mean, this is what I was talking about in my former slide, and trying to visualize that. And I'm not a graphics artist, so I hope, my slides or my images are helpful to explain what's going on in my brain. And so now here's another slide that I hope will explain what's going on. So, this here is this is an image that I created when I was doing a research project for a real estate company. And so they were asking what how can Indigenous research methodologies be used in to determine why there are not very many Indigenous people working in commercial real estate. And I mean, while the answer might seem obvious, but I think we need to really look at it from the lens of worldviews and the context of our reality. And for Indigenous people, like, what is the Indigenous context of our reality? What do we relate to, and what are our responsibilities? And so really, for us, I mean, we see ourselves in the context of all of our relationships. We're a reflection of the universe, and we're a reflection of the lands and the waters. And we know that if our lands and our waters are healthy, and then we'll be healthy, because we belong to the lands and the waters. It's not the other way around. So this image shows the context, shows how the context of Indigenous philosophies, our ontology, our epistemology, and our axiology, how these are really our reality. Our worldview is governed by natural law and the universal forces of constant flux. So an Indigenous paradigm is relational, and it consists of distinct philosophical assumptions around the nature of reality, the nature and purpose of knowledge, and this will in turn shape our ethics. And so, Indigenous scholars such as Leroy Littlebear and Gregory Kahady outline how an Indigenous worldview, an Indigenous reality is entrenched within this relational worldview that's in a state of constant flux. There's always changes that are happening. And constant flux has at its core the assumption that human beings are engaged in this dance with the universal forces of cause and effect, which can be visualized as energy in motion. So in this image here, the spider web represents this relational worldview, and the spider in the bottom right corner is the principle of constant flux, which will reverberate when the spider goes on the spider web. It will reverberate throughout this web of relational alliances. And so when we look at reality in this way, we can see how individual and collective human actions reverberate throughout time and space, which has an impact on our relationships. So our actions matter, both positive and negative, and these are of significant consequence. So within this relational worldview, individual ethical conduct is forged in the connection between mind and spirit. And this connection dictates the outcomes of our behavior. So the notion that our thoughts have power is well known in an Indigenous system. And embodiments of long-time lifeways, like our languages, our stories, our ceremonies, our protocols, and our practices, give structure to Indigenous cultures. And it's these cultural ethics that form our governance systems, which is based on an implicit enforcement of natural law. So traditional Indigenous thinkers still operate their ways in accordance with the constant flux of existence and understand that there's always a consequence for our actions. So members of traditional Indigenous society, we learned to police ourselves as opposed to being policed by an external force that's put in place to maintain social control. And this is how the Western system is structured today. So, despite this ubiquitous context of the Indigenous lifeways, the Indigenous reality, there's relatively little that is known about the Indigenous paradigm on the part of Western or Eurocentric systems. So, this visual image demonstrates that the Western system exists within and is also governed by natural law, but it's limited itself to philosophical assumptions that are governed by man-made law, which hold contrasting beliefs about the nature of reality, the purpose of knowledge, and the ethical principles that ought to govern human behavior. Bastien states that in contrast to First Nations, Eurocentric philosophies are more linear than holistic, hierarchical and specialized rather than generalized, more materialistic and self-interested than sharing, less concerned about relationships and kindness than competitiveness, more aggressive than respectful, and more focused on external sources of control and authority than on the development of internal controls. So even though we can clearly see how the Western system is governed by natural law, it's bounded by the limitations created by its own cultural paradigm, which is being rapidly globalized. So human-centric controlling forces delineate human behavior, and external social control mechanisms that are collectively validated and operationalized through man-made legislations will mete out consequences for those who transgress Western social order. So the interplay between scientific knowledge, imperialism, theoretical truths, and political ideologies collide to sustain global market economies that give rise to business models and approaches that are more concerned with the outcomes of material gain as opposed to the destructive processes of resource extraction, both human and environmental, that demarcate um, capitalist agendas. So I think in the context of assessment, and I want to always just kind of bring it back to assessment, is, like if we're developing external social control mechanisms through our academic integrity processes at the institution that are really based in punishment and all of that. And that's what we're focusing on. How can we control AI, or how can we control students so they don't cheat or whatever, instead of building students' confidence up in their own knowledge and saying, you know what, you can do this. And how do we shift that external control to really start nourishing and fostering internal mechanisms for control and ethical conduct with knowledge? So it's how are our students conducting themselves with their own knowledge? Are they being ethical in that way? So I'm going to skip over this slide a little bit, just because I want to move on and I want to talk about a paradigm. So a paradigm, and for those in philosophy, this will be really look very familiar, I'm sure. So a paradigm is just a frame of reference that forms a society's way of thinking, belief, values, customs, and behaviors. A cultural paradigm is a precedent-setting model of a group of people's way of life. So these paradigms will help govern how people relate to themselves and those around them. So a paradigm, the way I'm using it, is really, it's a way of life. We might think about it in that way, and some of the values that drive that way of life. So I'm going to skip over this slide here, and I want to talk about this. So this is just a visual of that cultural paradigm, that way of life. So and we have our ontology, which is, that branch of philosophy that's concerned with the nature of existence, assumptions about reality. So ontological questions we'll ask ourselves are, who am I? What is the purpose of life? Then we have epistemology, which is the nature and purpose of knowledge. Epistemological questions we might ask are, what do I know? What is knowledge? And axiology is concerned with ethics, notions of right and wrong, and how do I behave towards myself? How do I behave towards others? So for Indigenous people, we see our ontology, our reality. This is a perspective on reality that sees existence within a web of sacred alliances with the seen and the unseen. So an indigenous ontology is about sustainability, it's about process, it's about reverence for the unseen, abundance, and the continuity of our cultural lifeways. So we exist because of our relationships. So knowledge, epistemology, likewise, knowledge is relational for Indigenous people. And we come to know through multiple well springs of knowledge, knowledge that we can engage with, knowledge that we can build a relationship with. And then axiology refers to the analysis of values to better understand their meanings, characteristic, and origins. And so how are we in relationship to others? And an axiological question we would ask is, how do I behave towards others? How am I behaving towards myself? Am I being ethical to myself? Are the thoughts I'm thinking contributing to a beautiful expression of my humanity, or are the thoughts that I'm thinking merely perpetuating this suffering that I seem to be so addicted to, I guess you can say. And so these are some of these are the ways that a cultural paradigm, these are components of a cultural paradigm. And if we look at it in another way, for Indigenous people, this idea of Indigenous relational accountability. So, um, if we could look at in this other slide, we saw the axiology is concerned with ethics. And so for Indigenous people, axiology, the ethics, because uh, it's a relational existence, its knowledge is relational. And so these relationships form our ethical understandings of how we ought to behave with each other and with the world around us. And so that circle, the axiology or the ethics, it's vast. It's everything. And our epistemology is contained in that. Our ontology is contained in that. So our way of life, traditionally as Indigenous people, is really centered in how we treat and behave towards others, other humans, and the more than human world, as well as how we behave towards ourselves. And so, all of my relations as a way of life, this is reflected, our ontology is reflected in our creation stories. Our epistemology is reflected in our ceremonies, in our education, how we raise our children, our knowledge systems, and the ethics are reflected in protocols, cultural values, and principles. And so I have this image of at the very bottom, this is Crowfoot at the signing of the treaty or the negotiations of Treaty 7. And treaties are ethical agreements that delineate how we should treat each other and how we should act towards each other. And then here I have the Ojibwe hierarchy of creation. And so this is also, this is how another way that we might look at our relationship. So this hierarchy of creation, Basil Johnson writes that this isn't based on intelligence or beauty or strength or numbers. Instead, it's based on dependencies. So it places Mother Earth and her lifeblood, the waters, in first place. For without her, there would be no plants, animal, or human life. The plant world stands second, for without it, there would be no animal or human life. And the animal is third. The animal nations are third. And then last and clearly least important within this unique hierarchy come human beings, because nothing depends on us. Nothing depends on us for their survival. So because human beings are the most dependent of all, it is we who owe the greatest duty of respect and care for the other three orders, because without them we'd perish. So I think this is something that we can all agree on as human beings, that we're entirely dependent on the waters and on the lands. But yet we turn around and we make money off the lands. We're completely destroying clean drinking water sources, and we're treating the animals and the plant nations with complete ethical disregard in many ways. I mean, we create zoos so we can supposedly save them, but we also exploit them. I mean, there's all of these things that I think we can agree on, but yet are we mindful of this on the day to day? And so now I want to shift gears and I want to look at paradigm again, but I'm going to look at a Eurocentric paradigm. And so remember in the last slide, I had like that way of life, and then there was those three circles. So let's look at this. So Eurocentric thinking, we can see epistemology is huge. Ontology is obscured, and axiology is almost erased, the ethics. So, Eurocentric thinking is foregrounded by epistemology and separates epistemology from ontology and completely disregards axiology. So, this obscures the background assumptions of those who are producing knowledge by positioning a particular mode of existence, which is the Western social mode of existence, as, as natural, and in turn reproduces it as truth. So, the assumption is that this paradigm, this Western Eurocentric paradigm, is universal, but as according to Betty Bastine, by advancing a universal definition of self, and this individual is at the center of, of this way of life, humans are at the center, man is at the center. So, by advancing this universal definition of self, the Eurocentric paradigm constructs conditions for the denial of other forms of knowledge, other forms of knowing, and other forms of humanity. And this denial has been central to genocide and colonialism. So, knowing is understood as a cerebral activity. So what does this all mean for assessment? And I'm getting to that. So what makes an assessment practice relevant to us? So I guess we could look at personal resonance. So uh, am I going to choose just a multiple choice test because I was really good at multiple choice tests when I was a kid? Like, our personal, does this assessment practice or what have you, does it resonate with me? Or what about the uptake? And the uptake is the degree to which others are doing it. And is it proven to work? What research tradition is being used? For example, and then we'll also take the path of least resistance. Oh, I have a big class. I think I'm just going to do a online quiz. I'm just going to do online quizzes because I don't have time to mark all of a bunch of essay papers or what have you. So, assessment is so complex, but what we don't always see as relevant is our own understandings about about the role of power, both implicit and explicit. And assessment, I think it's important to understand that our cultural paradigm really does shape all of this. It does. So assessment includes all of the ways that we systematically provide learners with opportunities to show their learning with respect to these clearly articulated outcomes. They generate evidence of that learning. They'll receive feedback. Maybe they'll receive feedback if we have time to enhance their learning. So we have all these judgments to make, professional judgments about the extent to which learning outcomes are ultimately achieved. And there's a lot of power in that, and with personal resonance, there's a worldview that's at play there. And so we need to understand these things in critical ways. So I want to talk about this reclamation of a sovereign imagination, and what do I mean by that? And so to be sovereign means you're autonomous. Imagination is a free thing. And it allows us to fly with the eagles. It allows us to imagine a different reality for ourselves in the future. But it's also our imagination in many ways is also shackled by our culture, our assumptions about reality, about knowledge, about how we ought to behave towards each other. So for Indigenous people, it's really this idea of going inward. And Ermine says that our languages and our ceremonies suggest inwardness, and that it's this inwardness where real power lies. It's this space within the individual, our self-knowledge that has, according to Willie Ermine, has become the last great frontier and the most challenging. And so this developing this ability to go inward is understood as a responsibility towards self, toward each other, and toward our environment. So going inward, this principle of inwardness is really about honoring yourself and honoring your own knowledge and forging a stronger connection with your knowledge. And this is, our elders talk about this all the time. One of the biggest things that I remember being told is know who you are, and this is something that how are we giving our learners an opportunity to do that? And I think for myself and my practice, my teaching, self-assessment is, I think, is one of the most effective ways for learners to show what they know is through that process of self-reflection, guided self-reflection. And so this principle of going inward is really accessing this transcendent universe through self-connection. It's being in relationship with those unseen energies of cause and effect. And we're a part of that. So for Indigenous people, and I shy away from the word spiritual, because as soon as we use that, it's like we start thinking of religion, and then people say, oh no, I don't want to go there. It's not really that. It's, spirituality is really this acknowledgement that there are unseen energies out there that impact human reality in both implicit and sometimes explicit ways. And so it really is that spiritual exploration as opposed to external objectification of knowledge. So this progressive growth of self through a cyclical journey of repetition, experience, and construction of meaning. And this is a beautiful thing where you're constantly taking students back, where you're guiding students really back to themselves, where they can reclaim that, their knowledge and say, what I've learned in this class, let me show you about it, and so and also, how are we considering the plant and animal nations in assessment practices? Probably not really considering them, especially if we're not connecting our learning to them in intentional ways. And of course, it's about reframing our understandings of power and our understandings of strength. So for Blackfoot people, to be powerful really means that you're in connection with yourself, and that you're walking in balance. That's real power, is balance, because that's sustainability. That's about cultural continuity as well. And so this idea of kakyosin it's a Blackfoot word that means to be aware and observant of your environment. So self-reflection, this path towards inwardness, we have our ethical space that Willie Ermine, Cree scholar Willie Ermine has repurposed from Roger Poole's work. And so ethical space is used to interface between two disparate knowledge systems, the Indigenous and the Western knowledge system. But ethical space can also be created within self to gain a deeper understanding of how does the messages from the external mainstream society impact my own understandings of what it means to be a human being, and what are my responsibilities to my own knowledge, and how much of that is shaped by these messages about what is the purpose of knowledge, what is a good student, what is a successful student, things like that, right? So it's really about taking that objective lens we apply and turning it inward. And I know I just have a few minutes, folks, and so I'm almost done here. Sorry about that. And so ways of understanding self. Here's a framework that I use is being ethical in this, being in ethical inner space, being in these uncomfortable reflexive spaces where we're having this brave inner dialogue, rather than just slipping into this cognitive dissonance where we don't understand something, we just kind of tune out, and disassociate. Where instead of looking externally for answers, we really start questioning ourselves. What keeps me from challenging myself? Am I unwilling to engage with my own thinking in honest and critical ways? So we start asking ourselves these kind of things. So then we start owning our intentions and owning our impact rather than apologizing for how someone feels, for example. We start interrogating our personal assumptions, just as I had talked about earlier. What are my assumptions about success in academia, things like that? What pain have I taken on? So here I have, this framework here, this questioning framework is something that I developed for our research project, a partnership project that I've been working on, which feels like for years now. But this is where we're looking at how we can incorporate the teaching of Indigenous histories in really authentic ways. So here's a questioning framework that I've come up with that it's like, based on reflective analysis, what do I know about practicing in between worldviews? It's like, what are my assumptions about Indigenous people? What are my assumptions about my own knowledge? What values and beliefs are at play? What values and beliefs are at play when you are designing assessments, for example? Where do these values come from? All of that. So, this is sort of a questioning framework that I use. This is also a praxis-based reflexive framework for critical self-inquiry when exploring Indigenous knowledges and perspectives on history. And so this is really, I use this in different contexts, say, and I might, instead of we might even say, what makes an assessment method or a teaching and learning theory relevant to me? For example, what motivates me to step out of my comfort zone? And so this is about self-exploration. It's about challenging your current knowledge to gain personal insights. You can identify your own strengths. You can broaden your sense of responsibility. It's really about directing your own learning. And I think self-assessment is a powerful way to do that. Thank you, Jason and Sarah. Take care, everyone, and thank you to those who joined. I appreciate your attention.
Thanks for joining us on the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.